What's up, everybody? I know in my last video I said I was going to make my next video on the lore of the Mario series, but since Pokemon Sword and Shield have just come out, I've kind of got Pokemon on the brain, so here you go. Now, if you've been paying any attention to the Pokemon community over the last several months, then you're probably already familiar with many of the controversies that have surrounded the new Pokemon Sword and Shield games, all the way from their announcement to their release. These include everything from the Dexit controversy to hashtag Game Freak lied, which then got turned around into hashtag Thank You Game Freak. If you're at all interested in Pokemon, you'd have to be living under a rock to not know about these goings-on, right? Well, for the past 9 months or so, I basically have been living under a rock, particularly in regards to the Pokemon series. After the release of Ultra Sun and Moon, I decided that I wanted to go into Generation 8 as unspoiled as I possibly could. I haven't gone into a Pokemon game blind since Generation 3, and ever since then I've basically been keeping up with news and announcements for Pokemon games the moment they come out. For this generation, I decided to change that. Until Pokemon Sword and Shield came out, I not only tried to avoid any kind of trailers or announcements, but I also unsubscribed from YouTube channels and subreddits, anything that I thought would potentially have spoilers for the upcoming games. While this whole thing was kind of a huge pain in the butt, I was actually pretty successful. While I saw glimpses of the starters and the cover legendaries because, let's face it, they're basically impossible to avoid, other than that I went into my playthrough of Pokemon Shield pretty unspoiled. This also means that I was relatively blind to the controversies in the community as well. While I did know that the National Dex wasn't going to come back, once again, that's kind of impossible to avoid, I tried not to think about it and wasn't really part of the community uproar on either side. I continued avoiding spoilers throughout my playthrough, and I tried to savor every little surprise that the game had to offer. However, once the game was finished, I found that I still had a lot of questions, so I decided to go back and try to fill in all of the missing information that I could. Were there any Pokemon that I hadn't seen throughout my playthrough? And what little secrets had I missed? It was during this time that I really began to learn about the extent of the uproar that occurred in the Pokemon community during this time. I learned about all the controversies, the lies, and all the misinformation that was being spread by both sides of the Pokemon fanbase. As I did, I began to wonder what actually happened. A lot of the information that I was reading or seeing in YouTube videos seemed to contradict one another, and I saw plenty of people on both sides claiming that the other side was a bunch of ignorant idiots who were ignoring reality.
People gotta be stupid about it. People gotta be really stupid about it. And this is amazing. Like, reality has now become permanently distorted by these people's delusions.
That is the level of desperation people go to in order to enact their negative fabrication of reality.
In many ways, the controversy reminded me of that surrounded Star Wars The Last Jedi, and it seemed that fans couldn't agree about anything regarding these new games. On one side, you'd have somebody claiming that everything's bad and this is the end of Pokemon, and on the other side, you'll have people claiming that everything's going to be wonderful, this is going to be the best Pokemon game that has ever been, and they wouldn't accept even the tiniest bit of criticism. The more I researched, far from the issues becoming more clear, I just became more and more confused over time. On the whole, that's what this video is going to be about. What was going on with the development of Pokemon Sword and Shield? Why was the National Dex cut? Why was everybody so upset about it, and are these criticisms really valid? I know there are a lot of videos on this topic already, but I couldn't find a single one that brought all of the evidence together in a cohesive way, which is what I'm trying to do today. I want to be as thorough and comprehensive as I possibly can, and it was a lot of work to put this video together, so if you like it, please leave a like, it would mean a lot to me. Let's start with the thing that started it all, the National Dex. As far as I can tell, this whole split in the Pokemon community began when it was announced that the National Dex was not going to be brought into Pokemon Sword and Shield. This means that unless your Pokemon is native to the new games, you wouldn't be able to bring them over from previous entries in the series. Why was this announcement controversial? Well, ever since the beginning of the Pokemon series, the National Dex has been an implicit agreement between players and Game Freak that you would always be able to bring your favorite Pokemon over with you from a previous generation. Now, with Generation 8, this agreement has been broken. Whether you simply have a favorite Pokemon that you like to bring with you to every new game, or you've been meticulously maintaining a perfect Pokédex and collecting the shiny charm in every game so that you can hunt for shiny Pokemon, it doesn't matter. If it's not found in Galar, you're not bringing it with you. Now, on the surface of this decision, I think I can see both sides. After all, Pokemon very much encourages you to become attached to your favorite creatures, and to be told that you can't have them anymore can be really disappointing. I also have a favorite Pokemon. In fact, because my wife and I are such huge Pokemon fans, we both decided to sculpt each other our favorite Pokemon out of clay and use them as our wedding cake toppers. I still have those cake toppers. For my wife, I sculpted her a Sylveon, and for me, she sculpted a Dragonite. Dragonite isn't in these games, and that sucks. However, just because a game doesn't have all of my favorite Pokemon doesn't necessarily make it a bad game. I can also understand how, now that the number of unique Pokemon is nearly 900, it could be technically infeasible to bring them over to a new game, at least at first. If it isn't possible to bring all the new Pokemon in at once, this still leaves open the possibility that new Pokemon could be added in future DLC, or that the Pokédex could be slowly filled in on future games on the Switch. However, these possibilities were also erased when, in several interviews with producer Junichi Masuda, he announced that not only are there no plans to add new DLC for these games, but that no future Pokemon games will have the National Dex. I have to admit that this is incredibly disappointing news to me, and is undeniably a huge loss. Even if you think that removing the National Dex was inevitable or even a good thing, it's hard to argue that this isn't a major thing to remove from these games. However, not only did they remove the National Dex, but the total number of usable Pokemon in these games has been reduced significantly. Out of the nearly 900 total unique Pokemon out there, only around 400 or 45% are usable in these new games. That being said, a decision like this couldn't have been made lightly and would not have been done without good reason. Fortunately, the developers of Sword and Shield have clearly stated what these reasons were in several interviews. Just so it doesn't sound like I'm intentionally leaving anything out, I'm going to read the full quote from the interview with Junichi Masuda in his interview with US Gamer, where he initially revealed the reasons for removing the National Dex. There are a couple of different reasons to the thinking behind it, but really the biggest reason for it is just the sheer number of Pokemon. We already have well over 800 Pokemon species, and there's going to be more added in these games. And now that they're on the Nintendo Switch, we're creating it with much higher fidelity with higher quality animations. But even more than that, it's coming down to the battle system. We're making sure that we can keep everything balanced and give all the Pokemon that appear in the games a chance to shine. We knew at some point we weren't going to be able to indefinitely keep supporting all of the Pokemon, and we just found that Sword and Shield would probably be a good point to go back and reevaluate what would be the best selection of Pokemon that appeal to the widest audience, while keeping into consideration the balance of the battle system. It isn't just going to be all new Pokemon in the Galar region Pokédex. There's still going to be a lot of favorites that fans will be able to bring over that they've adventured with previously. But yeah, it was pretty much just balancing and getting this optimal selection of Pokemon for the adventure we wanted to provide. So based on that quote, there seems to be two main reasons. The first seems to be a technical reason. They wanted the Pokemon to look better and have higher quality animations. This reason was only further reinforced in a later interview with Famitsu, where they stated that every Pokemon model had to be remade from scratch, which also means that they would have to completely redo textures and animations. The second part seems to be a gameplay reason. They believed that by limiting the number of Pokemon, it would help improve game balance, presumably for competitive battling. However, this discussion around the reasons brings us to our next main topic. Did Game Freak lie? After Game Freak gave these interviews explaining the reasons for cutting the National Dex, the Pokemon community once again split into two camps. Those who accepted the reasons and those who rejected them. For this section, I'll mostly be discussing the technical reason given. That producing new models and high quality animations for the Pokemon would be technically infeasible. I will be discussing game balance in a later section. On the surface, the explanations that Masuda gave seem to be entirely reasonable. After all, 900 Pokemon is quite a lot, and having to remodel and reanimate them would be an incredible amount of work. It's entirely possible that Game Freak simply didn't have the time or resources they needed to produce these models and animations at the quality that they would like. However, these reasons only work if Game Freak is in fact telling the truth, and many fans suspected that they were not. Despite Game Freak's claims, these fans believe that these models and animations were not in fact new, and were actually reused assets from previous games in the series. If these allegations were true, it means that Game Freak did in fact lie to their fans regarding the reasons for removing the National Dex, even if it was not the only reason. And that's not a great look for a game company. So which is it? Did Game Freak rebuild all their assets from scratch, or were they reusing them from previous games? I'm going to get to that, but before I do, I just want to mention one thing really quickly. I want to be clear that the only reason I'm mentioning this is because I've seen a lot of discussion regarding whether Game Freak reused models and animations, and both sides have a tendency to make certain claims regarding those that they disagree with. Specifically, I've seen people on both sides claim that the opposing side is ignorant, doesn't understand how games work, and has no understanding of 3D modeling or animation. Therefore, before I get into the technical discussion, I do just simply want to mention that I do have a bit of experience when it comes to games and game engines. I'm currently pursuing a master's degree in computer science, and among the topics that I've studied include game engine design and computer graphics. And while my expertise is primarily in programming, I do have some experience with modeling, texturing, and rendering of 3D models. I also have a small amount of game industry experience, having worked for a summer as a game development intern with the team at Rooster Teeth Games. With all that out of the way, the evidence against Game Freak's claims does seem to be pretty damning. I'll begin by saying that when I first heard the claim that Game Freak had to completely remake their models and animations for Pokemon Sword and Shield, it didn't make a lot of sense to me. True, the Nintendo Switch and the 3DS are completely different pieces of hardware, but that by itself shouldn't necessarily prevent you from transferring models and animations from one to the other. While 3D models may seem complicated, they're all actually only made of three things: vertices, edges, and faces. Anytime you create or store a 3D model, what you're actually creating is a file that specifies the locations of various points and edges in 3D space. Even if you couldn't transfer the models directly due to a difference in file formats, all you would have to do is convert the data that makes up the model into a different format and transfer it to the new machine, which would allow you to reuse the same model. I know this is possible because not only are there a number of applications out there that perform this function, but I've actually written a program that does this myself, converting from one 3D file format to another. For those who are curious, it converted from DAE Collada format to OBJ. Therefore, simply switching hardware isn't really a major hurdle to reusing these assets. One thing that could be a reason for remaking assets is if the old assets are of low quality. The Nintendo 3DS had a relatively low resolution screen, only 400 by 240 pixels, so a model that looks fine on a 3DS screen might not necessarily look good on the Nintendo Switch, which supports full 1080p HD. Perhaps this is the reason the models and animations were redone. Not that they couldn't be transferred over, but that the old assets were simply too low quality to work on the Switch. Unfortunately, this also doesn't hold up. When 3D models were originally introduced into the Pokemon series with Pokemon X and Y, it quickly became clear that the models were too high quality to simply be intended for a Nintendo 3DS game. Pokemon games are some of the most data-mined games of all time, and it wasn't long before data miners got their hands on these models and found that they're all incredibly high-quality models with thousands of polygons each. Game Freak was planning ahead when they made these original 3D models. They knew it wouldn't be sustainable for them to keep remaking models for better and better hardware, so when they made the originals, they intentionally future-proofed them so that they could move them to more powerful hardware without a loss in quality. Not only are the 3DS models of a high enough quality that they would look fine on the Nintendo Switch, but we actually know for a fact that they look good on the Nintendo Switch because they've already been reused for Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee. While the models do look different from one game to the other due to differences in texturing and lighting, it's clear that the models themselves and the animations have both been reused for the Let's Go games. And look really good, might I add. However, just because we know that they could reuse the models doesn't necessarily mean that they did. While I think it would be an incredible waste of time and money to remake models and animations when you already have high quality assets to work with, it doesn't make it impossible that they did this. But remember when I mentioned that Pokemon games are some of the most data mined of all time? Well, that holds true for Pokemon Sword and Shield as well. And as soon as data miners got their hands on the models for the new games, it became immediately clear that these are the same models that have been reused since Pokemon X and Y. YouTuber DJ Fed Games put out a great video comparing the models gained from Pokemon Sword and Shield to those from previous generations. And while his entire video is great and I would totally recommend that you go and watch the whole thing, for now I'll just summarize some of his main points. First, most of the models for Pokemon that he found in Pokemon Sword and Shield were completely reused from previous games with no changes except for new textures. It isn't just that the models look the same, as some people claim, but they are made of completely identical vertices and edges. The wireframes themselves are completely identical. However, this didn't hold true for all of the models that he found. Some of the models did have minor tweaks, with the most major being for Pikachu because of course Pikachu gets special treatment. However, even the tweaks to Pikachu are relatively minor. He got a new mouth. Before, the mouth was just a texture, but now it's actually part of the model. However, other than the mouth, everything about the model is still the same. Another example was Raichu's cheeks, which had an extra layer on top of them, which was presumably to allow them to glow. This has now been removed because it is presumably not necessary with the new lighting engine. While there are some minor modifications to some of the models, most of them were completely identical, and it's pretty clear that none of the models of old Pokemon were rebuilt from scratch, as Game Freak claimed. This includes regular Dynamax Pokemon, which are simply scaled up versions of the same models with slowed down animations. However, this of course does not include Galarian forms of older Pokemon, or Gigantamax forms which would of course need new models. However, these special cases only account for a small fraction of Pokemon from older games. Similarly, it appears that all old animations were also reused. This includes animation from Pokemon Battles, as well as those in Pokemon Camp, which were reused from Pokemon Ami. I've spent a lot of time trying to show that Game Freak has in fact reused models and animations from previous Pokemon games in Sword and Shield. However, I don't want to give the impression that this in and of itself is a bad thing. All of the models and many of the animations are very high quality, and I don't necessarily think there's anything wrong with reusing high quality assets. I actually think it would be really dumb to waste time and money redoing them when they already look pretty good. Well, most of them. The only reason this is an issue is because Game Freak specifically claimed that part of the reason they removed the National Dex was A, they had to remake models from scratch, and B, they wanted higher fidelity animations. However, given the fact that the models and animations are in fact reused, coupled with the poor quality of some of the animations, means that Game Freak did in fact lie to the fans and the public. That is why this is an issue, not simply the reuse of the assets themselves. While most of the controversy surrounding #GameFreakLied revolved around the reused models and animations, that wasn't the only reason that Game Freak gave for removing the National Dex. The other reason was to improve game balance. Once again, on the surface, I think this is a perfectly reasonable idea. After all, the thing that sets games apart from other media is interactivity, and I think that gameplay should take precedence over pretty much anything else. That being said, I can't come up with any good reason why improving competitive balance would necessarily require them to remove over 50% of all the Pokemon. First, I want to mention that Pokemon Sword and Shield do create a number of changes that will definitely have an effect on competitive Pokemon battling. Some which I think are really positive, and others which are more questionable. Regarding positive changes, Sword and Shield introduce a number of things that make it much easier to raise and train a competitive Pokemon than in any other previous generation. For example, they introduce nature candies, which make it easy to make sure that your Pokemon has the perfect nature, and they introduce experience candies which can easily be farmed through max raid battles and make it really easy to quickly level up your Pokemon. In addition, the introduction of a number of held items such as heavy-duty boots are already having a major impact on the competitive landscape. There are also a number of changes that I think are somewhat more questionable. For example, the introduction of Dynamax and Gigantamax Pokemon may look flashy, but from what I've seen online, they're not being very well received by the competitive community. While I'm not huge into competitive battling, from what I've seen, the major complaints revolve around the fact that there's very little counterplay to Dynamax Pokemon. You can't force them to switch out, they're immune to a number of moves, They reduce the downside of certain restrictive items such as choice bands, and they cannot totally be blocked by moves such as Protect. Also, in addition to removing around 500 Pokemon, Game Freak has also removed around 144 moves from these new games. Although, to be fair, many of them are Z moves, and some of the removals do seem to make sense for competitive battling, such as the removal of Hidden Power or Toxic. However, whether you think these balance changes are good or bad, none of them necessitate the removal of the National Dex. While it's true that it's harder to balance an environment with 900 Pokemon rather than 400, not all Pokemon need to be included in competitive battles. The simple solution would be to introduce a rotation system similar to Magic the Gathering, where only Pokemon that are in the Galar Pokédex will be allowed in competitive battles, but any Pokemon will be allowed to be used casually. Or, even better, implement multiple competitive formats. One that only allows you to use the Galarian Pokédex with restricted moves, and another anything goes formats that allows you to use any Pokemon or attacks from previous games. As a matter of fact, this wouldn't even be new to the Pokemon series. Over the past few generations, Pokemon has introduced something called an origin marker, which is a little mark that you can see when you're viewing a Pokemon summary that tells you which game they originate from. Pokemon in Generation 6 have a blue pentagon, Pokemon in Generation 7 have a black clover, and there are other marks that tell you whether a Pokemon came from Pokemon Go, Let's Go, or even Generation 8. According to Bulbapedia, there's already policies in place that will only allow Pokemon with certain origin markings to be allowed in live competitions, or even in some online competitive battles. Even in Generation 8, only Pokemon with the Galar origin mark are allowed in live tournaments, so it doesn't really seem like letting players use the other Pokemon casually would have a negative effect on competitive balance. This is why I'm so confused. Game Freak definitely made this decision for a reason, but none of the explanations that they've provided really seem to hold up. Couple that with the fact that they definitely lied about remaking the models and animations, and I can completely see why so many fans are upset. While losing the National Dex is clearly a big loss for Pokemon fans, if Game Freak simply would have explained the real reason for removing it right away, I think the fans wouldn't have been as upset, and they probably could have avoided a lot of controversy. However, it seems that Game Freak is choosing to keep the real reason to themselves, and if I had to speculate, I would guess that it probably has to do with some internal squabbling between the various companies that have a stake in the Pokemon brand. Ownership over Pokemon is an extremely complicated subject, with different parts of the brand belonging to Nintendo, Game Freak, Creatures Inc., and the Pokemon Company. With so many different companies involved, some sort of disagreement between different stakeholders seems to be the most reasonable explanation I can come up with for why these changes were made. Throughout this video, I've mostly been talking about the removal of the National Dex and the various explanations for why this was done. However, that's far from the only change that was made in Pokemon Sword and Shield. While there are actually a number of changes that I like, there are several that I find very concerning. From the lackluster quality of the graphics when compared to pretty much any other modern RPG, to the lack of plot even when compared to other Pokemon games, and to the removal of so many key features, I can't help but be a little bit concerned about this franchise going forward. However, this video is getting long enough, so if you want to hear me talk more about those in a future video, please let me know in the comments down below. With all that said, I will try to remain optimistic. Despite its many flaws, Pokemon Sword and Shield was a pretty enjoyable game, and if Game Freak chooses to build on what they've done in this game instead of continuing to cut, then the future of Pokemon could be very exciting indeed. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, and subscribe if you want to see more game design content in the future. If you want to see more, you should definitely check out my other videos, and I also have over 100 articles on the Rempton Games blog, which you can find in the description down below. And join me next time where I'll be looking at how the designs of Pokemon have changed from generation to generation. Until then, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.